Hi, Marissa. Ira here. I am sharing with you here some audio feedback on your statement of belief that I hope will be helpful as you move from this to the defining good argument in digital context essay. My aim with the feedback isn't so much to provide criticism or responses to the statement of belief on its own, but rather to offer some thoughts and questions, some ways of thinking, or some thematic concerns that I hope will be helpful as you move from this on to the next assignment. So with that in mind, I'll just jump right in. You start off by noting the inevitability of argument and suggesting that it has something to do with our passionate experience of our own thinking and opinions, and a passionate experience of thought that leads us into argument. The suggestion then is that argument is about wanting people to agree with you. So my impression as I read this is that you're saying that the basic aim of argument, whether it should be this or not, mostly is to get people to agree with you, and thus to effectively persuade people, or at the very least get them to understand where we're coming from. So those seem to me like three clearly related but not exactly identical things. And so as we go forward, I hope you'll trace out a little more fully what that means, essentially, how these all fit together. So what does it mean to get people to understand where we're coming from versus effectively persuading those? Are they the same thing? Are they not the same thing? If they are the same thing, what makes them that? If they're different, how are they different but related, etc. And should getting people to agree with you be the goal of argument? Is that a reasonable or appropriate goal of argument? Yes, no, why? Especially in digital contexts and contexts where we often have multiple audiences. So you might be arguing with one person, but there are 2 or 3 or 5 or 15 other people chiming in one way or another. Or you're arguing with one person, and even though you're only arguing back and forth with one person, you are arguing for some other audience, some other collection of people. So in other words, the desire to have people agree with us, which I think you nail something really fundamental to what it feels like to be somebody, is we want on some level to have agreement about stuff, and we want people to agree with us. But I think it's tricky the way that plays out in these multilateral digital contexts where there's lots of different voices or maybe multiple audiences, etc. So with that in mind, I hope you'll think about the relationship between effective persuasion, getting others to understand us, and getting people to agree with us. How those three things are related and how they're different, so on and so forth. You present our lack of listening as probably the biggest barrier to good argument, and so I think it'd be nice if you could say more about what it means to argue well and effectively via appropriate listening. You do talk about that somewhat below, but I'd like to see you expand on that more. You present good argument here then as not rude or hostile or unforgiving. So not a fight that occurs on bad terms, not a war, but rather something else. And so I'm interested to know a little more about, well, what is that something else? So good argument isn't warlike, it's not hurtful, it's not painful, but what is it? What does it mean to argue in ways that are not rude or hostile or unforgiving? What's the positive thing that we do then? And why? At the same time, I'm also a little interested, what about moments where, just for instance, two people are having an argument on Facebook or on Reddit or or Tumblr or whatever. Tumblr works a little differently, but you know what I mean. Two people are having an argument somewhere online, and they're not really trying to persuade each other. They're each, in a sense, trying to persuade some other group of people. Does that shape whether we should be hostile or unforgiving? And if not, why not? And if so, how and why? So in other words, I'm really kind of asking you to think as we move forward a little more about how our efforts to argue in ways that avoid excessive pain and hurt, that avoid fighting on bad terms, that avoid winners or losers. When we try to avoid those, what is it that we do? And especially then in digital contexts, what is it that we do when our audience isn't always first and foremost the person we're talking to? So like when we argue back and forth interpersonally, face to face, our primary audience is usually whoever it is that we're talking to. But in digital contexts, it's a lot more complex than that. Sometimes it's whoever you're talking to, but it's also sometimes, whoever happens along and reads it, or some other definite, specific audience. Or other times, we're really thinking about argument that's not back and forth at all. It's an advertisement, or it's a politician's speech, or it's a review of a movie or a music album. So a lot of argument doesn't have a clear back and forth, and definitely a lot of argument that occurs in digital contexts and digital spaces doesn't have a clear back and forth. So I'm interested to hear more about how you think goodness in argument does happen in ways when argument isn't always directly, dialogically, one-on-one, interpersonal. And you do say good argument is patient and loving and understanding. But what does that mean exactly? Well, you say it has to do with listening and observing the one we're arguing with. And that makes sense. But I'd like to hear you elaborate a little bit more for you, what it means in argument to be patient and loving and understanding. And then again, thinking as before, especially when you're thinking about these multilateral or one-way transmission moments of argument in digital contexts, what does it mean to be patient and loving and understanding there? So there are a lot of the things that we do directly back and forth when we're arguing badly, right? We cut each other off, the speech intensifies, we talk louder, etc. A lot of that, it looks different in online settings, or some of it we don't do at all, but we do other things. So I'm interested to see how you'll work that up for the specifically digital contexts. But I'm also interested to see how you think about all of these pieces of goodness and badness and argument relative to that bigger question that we started off with, which is, what is argument for? What should good argument seek? Is it seeking to persuade? Is it seeking to be understood? Is it seeking to understand the other? Is it seeking to just express a view? Is it seeking to get a reaction? Is it seeking to persuade some other audience or affect some other audience? Do you always owe something to your interlocutor? If so, why? If not, why not? So these are the kinds of overarching considerations I'd like to see you moving forward. Tie these sort of components of good and bad argument back up to those bigger picture things. I'd also like to hear you. I imagine in the next paper, you may find yourself using Ratcliffe. Since listening is really important to you here. So I'd like to see you kind of really work out more fully what exactly it is about listening that's good. What's the point of listening? What's the value of listening? How does it serve good argument as you understand it? Then there's this stuff about the valid and the proven, and I'm not really sure exactly what you mean by that. So I'd be interested to know more what valid argument means to you, and what kinds of proofs are adequate or appropriate when a person's arguing. What does it look like to prove things adequately? And are validity and proof the same as you see them? And if so, how? If not, how not, etc. Then that you highlight that the thinking in terms of validity of proof brings us to analyze situations prior to arguing. Is it reasonable for people to be analyzing while they're arguing? Why not? And then when you close by really kind of coming back to that sense that good argument is about understanding and patience. That's what's, as you say, most important. Your second point about good argument being understanding and patient is what's most important. It's about showing love to those with whom we argue. So given that in a lot of different cases, we're not really going to be able to prove the correctness of our view, because a lot of different ways of looking at the world don't have that kind of necessitarian quality that you have in like a mathematical proof. If it is thus, it must also be thus. And a lot of the things that we argue about, it's not so clear that if it is X, it must also be A. If it is X, it could be A, but it could also be B or A minus 1 or whatever. And so, given that a lot of the kinds of things that we are most drawn to argue about are the kinds of things where it's least possible to really demonstrate conclusively the correctness of a view, how do we practice understanding and patience? So this is now getting a little bit at the mechanisms of argument. And I'm interested to hear, if you think this happens differently in these different modes of argument that we do in digital contexts. What are some of the similarities across sites and media online? And what are some of the big differences in how the values of understanding and patience cash out for us in argument? So, with all that in mind, I hope these comments are helpful. It just in sort of giving you some tools for thinking about that next part of things as you move into that. I also hope you'll reach out, make an appointment, come see me in office hours, or at a different time that we establish. And I look forward to continuing to read you and talk with you. So yeah. All right. Thanks.